there's a lot of events on campus today, so maybe they just got a little bit sidetracked. But this is the Trans Thriving 2018 conference, so we really appreciate your support for the trans community. As somebody who is a trans person, I really appreciate how everybody has come together for this, and how everyone has just kind of stepped up to the plate. So it's my job to introduce our keynote speaker, Meredith Teluzin, and I have her bio. So she's the executive editor of Them, which is Condé Nast's first ever platform devoted to the queer community. She's an award-winning journalist and author, having written features, essays, opinion pieces for publications including The Guardian, New York Times, Atlantic, Vice Magazine, Wired, The Nation, Mike, BuzzFeed, and The American Prospect. She's the recipient of the 2017 GLAAD Media Award for Outstanding Digital Journalism, and has contributed to several books, included Nasty Women, Feminism, Resistance, and Revolution in Trump's America, kind of important. And she's graduated from Cornell University with an MA in Comparative Literature, an MFA in Creative Writing, from California College of the Arts with an MFA in Visual Art, and earned a BA in English and American Literature from Harvard. Her memoir, Fairest, is forthcoming from Viking Press, which is a division of Penguin Random House. So if you'll join me in welcoming her, Meredith, come on up.
Hi, everyone. Megan asked me whether they wanted me they should read my whole bio, and I said why not, because just because I wanted to really present this sort of the contrast between how I present myself to the world, the type of image that I convey to people in order to gain respect in the industries and the rooms that I'm in, which is particularly important for a trans woman who I'm originally from the Philippines. I'm a first-generation immigrant. I'm albino, so I have all of these, whatever, I belong to all of these marginalized groups, and it's a really common experience that I have that, I would be in a room and somebody's bias meter is going to be tripped by one of these, identities. If a person happens to be trans people, I'm cool with trans people, sometimes, they're unaware of their unconscious bias towards women. Or, they would be totally fine and totally queer friendly and cool with me being a woman, but would have ingrained biases about disability, right? And I've developed a ton of coping mechanisms, defense mechanisms, et cetera, in order to counter this potential for discrimination. And one of those coping mechanisms is that I over-prepare for talks like these, and I assiduously write notes, and I either write beautifully crafted texts that I've been trained to to make for that I've been trained to create for really decades now, or sometimes I actually pretend that I'm giving a talk spontaneously when in fact I have memorized said talk. This is not one of those talks. I actually intentionally, over the past few weeks since I've been invited to come and speak to you, and it obviously is a really great honor, and I absolutely love speaking to groups of trans people and people who care about trans people. I've just been kind of thinking in my head, and just sort of what do I want to talk about? At some point I'm going to write this talk, and it's going to be beautiful. Everybody's going to be so impressed with me, and it's going to be great. But then I sort of realized, especially over the last couple of days, with the Brett Kavanaugh and Christine Blasey Ford stuff that, and as I felt more and more vulnerable, and as I felt, um, as like that entire, sort of like national experience has challenged a lot of the defense mechanisms that I've built for myself. Um, I just really feel like it's really important to for me, and like in the context of this talk, to try to be as kind of like honest and vulnerable with you as possible, which is actually very difficult for me in a public context, as you can probably tell. But yeah, and so I actually didn't have, like I don't have this like huge, well-structured, elegant talk. What I have for you is just a set of experiences that I've had, and a set of principles that I've lived by, throughout my life that I've, thankfully had the opportunity to think about through this talk. And also, hopefully, kind of like a set of concrete ways, suggestions for me to give you, around both, dealing with obstacles as a trans person and helping trans people deal with obstacles. Um, so apart from, like these identity categories that I've talked to you about, I grew up in the Philippines. I moved here when I was 15. The other major thing that I should say is that I also grew up in a really unstable home. My parents had me when they were very young. They were 17. They, were still figuring out how to be adults, right? And I know that now, but at the time, I experienced that as a kid, um, as like them being really neglectful, parents, and really, and I had like a lot of experiences with them that were really difficult. They both had, throughout my childhood, really bad addiction issues. My mom was addicted to gambling and would, kind of like go off on gambling sprees for, like for many days at a time, and leave me to the care of relatives, et cetera, et cetera. My dad had a lot of substance abuse problems, and I had, the experiences like, like one of the most difficult experiences I had as a kid was that my parents routinely locked me in a room, like when, like starting probably like when I would say like 4 or 5, like pretty early memories. Like when they went out at night, they would just lock me into the room. And I remember, just feeling really scared and being really distraught, and but eventually normalizing to the situation because it happened over and over again. And throughout my childhood and young adulthood, especially when we moved to the States, and I didn't have that support system of family that I had in the Philippines, I experienced a lot of those periods of neglect and abandonment. Um, and what's really interesting about growing up in that kind of household, right, is that a lot of people grow up in that kind of household, and they completely understandably, come out and find it really difficult to, live in the world because of all of those traumas, and to cope with, like with whatever it is that they need to cope with coming out of that background. And one of the things that I really, really remember really clearly as a kid was really, really wanting my parents, or like really, really wanting the world to understand that I was like a neglected kid who was not okay, right? And I knew that one of the ways, or the best way for people to understand that, was for me to be a bad kid. Like was for me to act out, was for me to like fail in all of my classes at school, because then it would prove to everybody that my parents were bad parents, right? And I remember like sitting in my room, like I really just kind of like want to fail, like I want to be like a terrible kid. But then every time that I had this thought, like I also thought to myself, but if I become a terrible kid, then that means that I would actually grow up to be like my parents, right? That I would never um, be able to overcome um, whatever it is, like whatever the cycles that led to my parents being the way that they were. And I think also like even more importantly, I felt like if I were a terrible kid, then I would let my parents define me. I would let what my parents did to me determine who I was as a person. People who didn't care for me in the ways that I wanted. And I had a really, really strong desire and need to determine who I would become as an adult for myself. And I learned from those early experiences to be really self-sufficient. I grew up very fast. I grew up very young. Like especially as a first-generation immigrant, my parents, they didn't speak English very well. When we moved, we didn't have, like a lot of support. I went to, a pretty mediocre public school, and so I really had to do all of that, kind of like self-determination work, figure out, figure out that I wanted to go to college, figure out, like how to, like you know, actually be able to dream of, like going to Harvard as a first generation immigrant kid. Like I came to Harvard as a full scholarship kid, 2 years out of, out of coming to America, right? And um, and I feel like that experience really, in a lot of ways, prepared me for the obstacles that I encountered as an adult, especially the experiences that I had around transitioning and being trans. Because when I transitioned, when I started transition in 2001, so this was a time when the stigma around, the being trans was much more unfamiliar to people, right? A. And B, there was just like a lot of stigma and judgment around transitioning at the time, right? And you know, for trans people here who've been in early transition, like a lot of you are probably also familiar with this, like from reading stories and being up on trans culture. Like I was subjected to street harassment on a regular basis. Like people, whether explicitly or implicitly, thought of me as mentally ill. People were really fighting to change my view about myself just because I had this realization about me that I did not want to live in the gender that I was assigned at birth. That for me, this realization was, that it's a really fundamental, important aspect of me, but it doesn't make me any less capable. It doesn't make me, it doesn't somehow, like erase all of the things that I was before I started transitioning. So the experience of all of a sudden, like being perceived as like more mentally unstable, as being dumber, right? I mean, like, full stop dumber. I was working at MIT at the time, and I had to actually um, create objective systems in order to demonstrate to people that they were questioning my judgment more. So like I did this really funny thing where I tracked my calendar entries with my boss, who was a professor at the time, and and pointed out to him that whenever we met, our meetings used to be scheduled for 15 minutes, and then they ended up like getting scheduled for 30 and then 45 minutes. And the rest of that time was just spent with him questioning my judgment, because like he couldn't, because as soon as he saw me through a female gendered lens, all of his unconscious biases kicked in, and things that he took for granted that I knew before I transitioned were suddenly things that he needed confirmation from me. He needed to, that he needed to somehow, you know, get some form of, that he couldn't defer to a woman's judgment in the same way that he could to a man, which of course also affected my self-esteem, which then there is this sort of, there can be this sort of negative feedback loop that happens, which is part of why gender relations and misogyny isn't just this straightforward thing of, of saying, oh, like you should just treat everybody equally, or, or the sort of situation where, oh, like a woman is just like less capable, and, like we can demonstrate that, right? Like our behaviors and attitudes towards each other are constantly affecting the one of the things that, oh, I don't know what the difference between these two mics are, but um, one of the one of the things that I feel really fortunate um, to have lived in and through is a childhood in the Philippines, because the Philippines has a really strong indigenous third gender tradition. Third gender people have been part of indigenous Philippine society since pre-colonial times. Third gender people at the time, occupied high places, were perceived as special people. And I know that, in American culture, that it's often, people are familiar with two-spirit people and two-spirit culture, and how a lot of Native American indigenous societies, have similar traditions within their own culture. But I think whenever I've seen that communicated in a lot of these types of conferences or in popular media, it sort of gets, I find it that it gets weirdly kind of like as exoticized, like as if it's just like, oh, like that bygone day of like, the ideal Native Americans, like before the colonialists came to mess it all up, right? And that it's sort of like a time and place that's in the past. And for me, I live that in my being and in my daily life, right? Like I very much think of it as an enormous advantage having lived, having been perceived as both a man and a woman throughout my life. And actually, these days, like depending on how I dress, like I get perceived as all sorts of different things because it gives me an incredible amount of perspective that other people don't have. Like one of the things I consider it one of my major assets as a manager that I get along well, pretty well with, with pretty much all genders and and have had experience embodying the perspectives of different genders. And so, and that it's an advantage mediating between people, and talking through all of these misunderstandings and, and interpersonal conflicts, et cetera, et cetera. And that's a role that I've played for a lot of my life and have been, and have, like not to toot my own horn, but I've been pretty good at it, I think. And I feel like our culture is so focused on trying to be like, oh, like how can we help these poor trans people that we don't talk enough about how having that type of diverse perspective, having a, a window into the world that cisgender people don't have, it just creates, especially because we live in such a gendered society and a gender, like a gender segregated society, how important that is. Like how important, like I recently read Thomas Page McBee's memoir, Amateur, in which he talks about he prepared to be a boxer for a charity fight at Madison Square Garden. And so he, as a trans man, ended up like training really, really intensely with men, with cis men for months at a time, right? And having somebody who was assigned female has spent their life in a female social role, be able to unpack that dynamic and how men work and, and what it's like between men when they're alone together is just so invaluable. And when I think about it, when I think about the ways in which cisgender people underestimate and don't value trans people in society, I actually feel bad for cis people. Like I just feel like trans people have so much to offer, and cis people, not being able to sort of get out of their own way to be able to take advantage of those insights is just as detrimental to cis people as trans people and detrimental to our whole society. And it's detrimental also to our society that the discrimination that trans people face makes it so much harder for us to come into our own and to fulfill our potential. I did a talk recently. I mean, I did not a talk. I did a long form article recently, actually in 2015, for BuzzFeed on transgender call center workers in the Philippines. And what's really interesting about that entire culture of transgender workers in call centers, as you know, or as you may know, right now in the Philippines is one of the leading call centers in the world and has, kind of quickly overtaken India because apparently Americans prefer Filipino accents, and we were a former Philippine colony, so like we can talk to you about Beyonce better um, than or Bruno Mars, who is like our national hero because he's Filipino, um, and like better than Indian people. But in any case, trans people and specifically trans women in that context are disproportionately managers, right? And one trans woman put it to me this way, like look, like we're up really really late at night. They usually keep U.S. hours, and so and the Philippines is exactly 12 hours ahead on the East Coast, so they work from 9 p.m. to 5 a.m. One of the girls told me, like, what other manager can simultaneously like direct people, but then like at 3 o'clock in the morning, like put on a wig in a variety show in order to keep people awake, right? And I think that in a Philippine context, people understand that. Like people understand that a trans person in that context has incredible value, and that's part of why they tend to rise in that context away from the forces of discrimination that keep us down, right? So that's one thing. So that's one thing that I want, that I would love for all of you to think about philosophically, to sort of like account for and understand that trans people in this country are constantly at risk and subject to discrimination, and yet at the same time, like understand that quality of transness is very specific to this culture, and that trans people have an incredible amount to offer and have had an incredible amount to offer in many, many other cultures, right? So that's one thing that that I wanted to convey philosophically. Another thing that I wanted to convey philosophically is this idea that like, as I said before, that this that obstacle that it's really important as a trans person to not let other people define you, right? Like, and that happens constantly. And so for me, it's been very important to monitor the ways in which unconscious bias operates both on me and through me, because because one of the things that happens a lot is that we don't, even as marginalized people, we often absorb the unconscious bias that that our own culture and our own society is trying to impose on us, and and it requires constant monitoring to do this, right? I had this. I wrote an essay for a volume recently in which I talked about this experience where I was a technical assistant at MIT. It was my job for a couple of years after undergrad. As you can tell, I'm a total nerd. I've been a nerd all my life. I just hide it well. And my job was to design scientific figures during that entire time. And I was in a situation once where somebody, I was in a class and somebody was presenting a graph that I knew immediately was inaccurate, but I was post-transition, and so I couldn't just be like, hey, like, that's wrong. I knew that I had to ask a question, or like I felt at the time compelled to ask a question because I think I was like 2 years post-transition. So I was doing this whole like, oh, like this is how quote unquote women do things. So then, like I asked, like, oh, can you clarify? I think there might be something inaccurate. And he went through his entire explanation again, and it was still wrong. And then I said, and then I said something like, yeah, like I think I still notice a discrepancy. And he said, this is basic math, Meredith. Um, and, like, which in itself is terrible, right? But what was terrible was that the first thing that came into my head was, oh my God, I must be wrong, right? Which would have just like never occurred to me before transition as a person who spent several years actually designing these figures and like and like having whatever elite education that I had before that. And ever since then, like I've been super I have like I literally like think to myself, like as part of I journal every day. Like I one of the things that I do, and a lot of writers do, which I think is actually good for everybody, is I keep a memory journal. So on a regular basis, I write down the things, the like highlights and the things that I remember. And writers do this so that we can, like go back and and use it for material. But I think it's actually a good practice for everybody. Um, but ever since then, like I've had to really, really track the ways in which my unconscious biases are operating on other people and also myself. So that's one thing that I think, that I think is really important is to sort of, is to monitor the way that that the world is operating on you. Obviously, like obviously support systems are really important. A lot of trans people, don't necessarily have the most supportive families, or a lot of trans people lose friends as they transition. I certainly did, and I think it requires a lot of strength, right? To be like, there are billions of people in the world, right? And it hurts when somebody that you care about, leaves your life for this reason. But it's not about you. It's not about, and that took me a really long time as somebody who forms really close friendships, to realize that it's not, like it's about them. It's their, like whatever it is that they're reacting to about your transition, it's not about you. Like it's not, it's them having to deal with their own biases, and that it's important to find your own sources of support, which are often, and to reach out to people for those sources of support, because, we live in a culture, well, I live in New York, and so everybody's busy all the time, right? And so it becomes important to, to find those people who you can have this sort of source of mutual support with, because otherwise, like the stresses of the various things that we have to deal with, like we run the danger of it getting the best of us, right? And then the other thing that I wanted to talk about is I've always had, the other thing that I have been really passionate about in my life, other than being a writer, is dance. And so there's been this sort of like balance between those two activities in my life. And ever since I was a little kid, like I was told that I was smart, right? But dance is this activity that I do because I'm actually like kind of pretty bad at it. Like I'm albino, so like I don't see very well. And like when I started out, like I was like super awkward and gawky. And so when I'm in dance class, and like when I'm in school and I do well, there's a certain degree in which that's expected. But when I'm in dance class and I like figure out the combination, or like, or like I'm at a party and I raise my leg and people are just like, oh, like how, like how do you do that? There's something that's been really, really beneficial for me about having like an activity that I just do, because it's fun and it's great, but also a way for you to be, I think, any practice that allows you, that you're passionate about and that allows you to be away from the sort of, from the daily sort of like difficulties and stresses of your life really does really well in terms of putting things in perspective. And the wonderful thing about dance is that it's abstract. Like literally for an hour and a half, like I'm just being like, okay, like 1, 2, 3, 4, like how do I, it's like a live video game. My partner is really into video games, and I've been trying to sell like dance costume as a live video game, but he hasn't bought it yet. So yeah, so like dance, swimming. I because I'm getting older and I have bad knees, I tried to switch to swimming, and I still do swimming, and I love swimming, but I prefer dance. Those types of activities and passions, and that your recreation and finding ways to rest your brain is really important, which is also, and it's also important to then talk about social media and the advantages and disadvantages of social media. Social media for me is a necessary evil. It's part of my life. It's part of like being in media in New York. And there are things that I really love about social media. Like I love that I'm able to connect with various people. I travel a lot. Hopefully, like some of you, like some of you who are interested in following me on social media, and staying in contact in social media, that's all really great. But it's also, but I very much intentionally limit my social media intake because social media has been shown, through scientific studies to really, to actually make us feel worse a lot of the time, right? Like I was in Guatemala in August writing. I was at Lake Atitlan, and I was just like so enthusiastic about posting pictures on my Instagram story of this like beautiful, pristine lake, like amazing, amazing view. And then I got back in September, and one of my friends was on vacation in Lake Como and was posting all of these pictures, and I was just like, ugh, like I'm back in my office, and like I really want to be on that lake again. I remember that feeling, and then I was just like, okay, like you're allowed to have your whatever, like 30 minutes to an hour of social media in order for you to catch up with all of the things that you catch up with. And it's even allowable for you to feel, like this really human emotion of like wanting to be somewhere else. But I think having activities that are more geared towards like moving you away from the world that you're in to a different mental space is really beneficial. Like for me, it's dance. For a lot of people, it's meditation or yoga, or some sort of sport, running. A lot of people, and that's been super important for me. I'm gonna monitor how much time I've taken up. Um, so it seems like this might be a good time. Well, no, okay. The my my desire for an elegant talk necessitates that I try to improvise a closing, a sort of conclusion for you, because I just can't end with, my brain still thinks in papers or articles, like I need in a feature story, this would be a kicker. This is what it's called, the kicker section. Okay, so this is my live kicker section. So I was, after transitioning, I went to grad school at Cornell, and I was undisclosed as trans at Cornell. I just couldn't, like I just decided, like I just don't want to deal with the questions. I don't want to deal with all of the things that you have to deal with as an openly trans person. And so I only told close friends for, like for several years, right? And then I decided to start writing op-eds about being trans, which meant that I became openly trans. Again, after a period of not being openly trans, and within a year, right, I experienced the worst harassment, uh, incident or set of incidents, event that I've had in my life because I was living in a graduate student dorm that I actually had a scholarship to live in. So that I was economically dependent on my housing. And one of my housemates in my dorm ended up being severely transphobic. Um, and and I won't tell you the whole story, but it was just like a really, really terrible experience. And I think one of the most terrible things about it for me, well, there were a number of terrible things about it. Like one was that I was blindsided, because I thought, oh, like I've been post transition for so long, like I've gotten over all of the things that I've gotten over. Apparently not. B, that like I decided to report it, and because I felt like I had a lot of support, I was the president of, I had previously, before I came out, been the president of this co-op. Like this entire group of whatever 20-something people thought that I was capable enough to be a president of the co-op. And I underestimated the degree to which, to the degree to which people are people empathize with victims as long as they don't have to make the sacrifices, as long as they don't have to be the person to sort of accept that this is happening, that they let this happen, that that this is happening in an institution, in a context that they care about. So I actually ended up being literally homeless for a couple of weeks during that period, and being forced to move out of my graduate dorm in the middle of Ithaca winter, like in November of 2015, and I was in a really, really difficult, desperate situation, and I remember having those same feelings. I was on a phone with, with the current president of the co-op saying, like, how do you want me? I literally said this because my home was, was my safe space and was being challenged. And I said, how do you want me to hurt myself to prove to you that this person is psychologically affecting me? Because I will do it. Because if that's the only way that you can understand the impact that this is having on me, then that's what I'll do. And so I was in a super, super desperate, difficult place, and but it was also in that place that I made this decision, right? Like I just didn't want to leave my room. I needed to be, the reason why I ended up having to move out of my dorm is that I became so afraid of this person that I couldn't be in common spaces around them. And there was a point when I really thought that all of my systems were going to shut down, and that, especially because I was so tied to school, like school has literally saved my life. So the feeling that school wasn't supporting me in a situation was really debilitating. And then what I ended up feeling was, okay, like you can't deal with your situation, but you can deal with other people's situations, right? Like I still was capable of helping other people. I was still capable of writing other people's stories, of being able to report on cases, or of that I still had my talents, and my talent has always been to communicate experiences, to communicate ideas to other people. And it was out of that really deep sense of desperation that I actually ended up, being a really, really prolific writer. So this incident happened in late 2014. I ended up I ended up writing something like 35 articles in 2015. Um, and I was doing that because what I couldn't process, like what I was still struggling with in my own life, I I found myself being able to imbue in the stories of other people and in talking about, you know, what matters to trans people at large. I did, like this really big investigative piece for Vice magazine, which is now, my reporting for that has now been the subject of a documentary film that's screening all across the country. And you don't have to do that. Like, I don't feel like everyone needs to feel obligated to be productive, quote unquote, because of the fact that they're, like feeling attacked or feeling discriminated against. But I do feel like it's important to sort of like find your capacities and the reserves within yourself and see if there's a seed that can grow, like from the experiences that you have. And maybe, it's possible and it's totally okay, for you to feel the way that you feel and seek support and take time, to be able to, figure out how to right yourself and be balanced when you've experienced, or people that have experienced significant discrimination, or other forms of trans-related bias. But I do think that seeking ways in which, through which to funnel some of those energies in ways that are not productive in this, like, like we're all, kind of like worker bees in this, capitalist system, but productive, personally productive, ways for you to help other people and to make an impact in the world, I think is really, really important. And I have to say, I'm actually reasonably impressed with my kicker section, and so I'm gonna end on that note and open up. I think we have a few minutes for questions, maybe. Yeah, we have some time for questions. So thank you so much for the opportunity to talk to you. So the question was, like I had this bad experiences at Cornell, like do I think that they've gotten better about this stuff? I think that they've, from what I've heard, they have gotten better. So when this happened to me, right, there are a number of facets of the situation, right? So when this happened to me, the school couldn't really, didn't really know how to classify it. That's one of the really difficult things, is that trans harassment is not something that a lot of institutions have had to deal with, right? So I was actually funneled through the same system and the same set of procedures that that students go through when they report either sexual harassment or sexual assault. And one of the things that I found at Cornell was that which is, if people are familiar with the Emma Silkowitz situation, it's actually pretty similar. You go into a room, you report what happened with an employee of Cornell University. You don't have anybody with you. That person takes notes, and those notes become the record through which your entire case is going to be judged. You have no opportunity to amend the notes, and you have no opportunity to correct them. The words of the investigator, quote unquote investigator, that's hired by the university becomes word. In the meantime, the person that you accused has a law student that is paid by the university to represent them and guide them through the adjudication process in the university. As far as I know, that changed in a few years ago, and they now have representative who also represents the victim. So that's one of the changes. The other thing that happened that was really glaring to me was that at the time there was a lot of talk about, and there's been a lot of talk of sexual assault on campus. The dean, so they eventually said there was no harassment, and then I appealed, right? And the dean who adjudicated this appeal, who is a known, who has been, kind of like a sexual assault advocate, an anti-sexual assault advocate, has done, has like screened films, documentaries related to sexual assault. In her letter, that said that my accusations of harassment were incredible, one of the reasons why my accusations were incredible was that I had invited this person to a party. I had invited this person to go to a party with me after the alleged harassment took place. So as a result, I must be on good terms with this person, and therefore my accusation of harassment was incredible. And I really hope that, that at that specific time, the university was just like really trying to protect itself. Because I really hope that, in hindsight, that dean could see how, that exact pattern of a person who is being harassed, trying to normalize the situation, trying to deny for themselves that this terrible thing that's happening to them is actually taking place. And one of the coping mechanisms that victims have is to try to normalize relations with, with their perpetrators. And that's the thing, is that there's a lot of discussion when things like this happen of like, oh, like we've learned our lesson, like we're going to do things better in the future. To this point, Cornell has not acknowledged that they've, or Telluride House, which is where I was living, they've done anything. And that's also like one of the labors that we do as discriminated people, is that, oh, things always get better in the future, but we're not actually going to address, like what happened in the past. And of course, I experience the exact same dynamics that I experienced as a kid, which is that I really, really kind of like want to fall apart, and I really, really want to like demonstrate how what happened had, like affected my life in really terrible ways. But to do that would be to allow that incident to define me. So instead, like I try to be as well known and famous as possible, so that then they wish that they could claim me, but they can't. That's semi-ironic.
So if you go on to the website, so everyone pull out their phones, right? I am very commanding, very deliberate today. So if you go to transthriving2018.wordpress.com, so the same email, or if you have your schedule, you could use your camera to use the QR link. Under conference, there's a little drop-down button. Are we all seeing it? Okay, there's a section called photo elicitation. Click on that. Then there's a link where you can upload photos. The idea is that Bernadette is going to do a session later today where she needs your pictures. So if you would like to participate in this, it's an active session, sort of, right? Active participation, you upload 2 photos that define how you... So one photo for you where you feel included, one photo for where you feel excluded. If you upload the photos, we will use them in a PowerPoint, and you may be asked to talk about them, so please upload photos that you feel comfortable speaking about. And then we're going to head over to Belknap for a set of panel sessions. We'll be in Belknap for about 2.5 hours, and then we'll have lunch. But on the way to lunch, grab some food outside, if there's food still there. Okay, snacks and coffee, food in Belknap. Let's all migrate in one big mass session. And follow Diane, or Thank you so much.